3. Great. So just like for documentation purposes, could you like
state name and so forth, yeah.
Your affiliation?
Yeah, my name is George Washington. I'm an attorney for BAM, a member of BAM, and I'm an attorney in Michigan.
Great. I was wondering if you could, if we could just start out with your involvement in California and the work you were doing around affirmative action in California.
Sure. Well, I think BAM started out in California in like 1995, and I, of course, provided some level of advice and some level of information and so forth to California on that. And during the cases in Michigan, California was like this great laboratory, which we all looked at to see exactly what these Ward Connerly initiatives would mean. But our first effort in California on Prop 209 itself was the lawsuit we brought in 2008 against Proposition 209. And what was remarkable is that from 1996 to 2008, despite the catastrophic drop in black admissions at UCLA and Berkeley, and the drop in Latino admissions at those schools and in all of the UC graduate schools, that essentially nobody, none of the established civil rights organizations had brought any kind of challenge to 209 since that time. And so what we filed was the first challenge to it. And we lost at the U.S. District Court in San Francisco, and we lost in the Ninth Circuit, essentially because I think the establishment in California has become comfortable with 209. But I think the effort was nevertheless tremendously important, just in legal terms, because it helped reignite the fight around affirmative action in California. It got us a lot of support on the Michigan case. And now that if the Michigan case does indeed go to the Supreme Court, it effectively means 209 will be in the Supreme Court. So even though we lost the legal challenge, we helped build a movement, and and the loss on the legal challenge is perhaps only temporary if this goes to the Supreme Court.
What are some of the effects that we started to see in the UC system after the ban on affirmative action went into effect?
The numbers of black students at the most selective schools, UCLA and Berkeley and the graduate schools and some of the other campuses and some of the other programs, dropped by half and more. For Latino students, the drop was similar, and it was compensated somewhat by the tremendous increase in the Latino population, young population of California. So the absolute numbers don't show quite the same decline, but if you measure that in relation to the population, it means that the number of Latino students going is about half of what it should be if they were being admitted at the rate that they were before Prop 209 went into effect. And what you've seen is, in California, is a cascading effect or a resegregation of the University of California, in which it's true that there are a number of black and Latino students admitted to the UC as a whole, but they're concentrated at the Riverside, the Merced campuses, and other campuses, which people recognize don't provide the programs, the opportunities as the great flagship universities of the UC do. And there's even figures which show that if you compare the population of the flagship universities of California, UCLA and Berkeley, to the population of the state, it is one of the most segregated systems in the country. The only places that surpass it are Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. And that is a scandal for a state like California.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the importance of BAM's perspective within the debate that was happening around affirmative action, and what lies or misleadings that Ward Connerly was bringing forth that BAM was able to expose.
Sure. I think Ward Connerly uses the word preference all the time to describe affirmative action. And that word is not accidental. If one looks at the history of the civil rights movement, when Andrew Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Act, he called it a preference. When the senators from the South opposed the civil rights bills in the 1960s, they called it a preference. And really, that's a term that's always used against any change in the racial status quo. And what it really means for Ward Connerly is that they're admitting students who are black or Latino with lower average grades and test scores than white students who are admitted. And the problem is that those standards are biased standards. There's no question that students in black and Latino schools have less stable schools, have less programs available, and of course they're not going to get the kind of 4.3 and 4.4 that somebody from Beverly Hills can get. And even more on the tests. Those tests are normed on suburban students and suburban curricula. And they both reflect the discrimination in society and they exaggerate it. And affirmative action is not a preference at all. It's simply an attempt to correct for those unfairnesses in those criteria. And I think most of the liberals have not taken that on. And that is a critical failing because it allows Connerly and people like him to claim that they're for equality when really what they're for is for a racially biased status quo and determining on that kind of basis. And I think even today, for example, just a few weeks ago, the LA Times wrote an editorial said that, well, we're for equal rights for black people and for Latinos, except when they seek a preference, and we're not for equal rights in that kind of situation. Well, but what they mean by preference is exactly what Ward Connerly means. And what that really comes down to is we're for equal rights unless you challenge the racist criteria, which are unequal. And it essentially means you're not for equality. So I think that's been the unique character of the arguments we've made. I think the other thing that we've stressed over and over again is that one has to build a movement. That however good the logical arguments might be, and those have existed for a long, long time, unless you have particularly young people fighting on this matter, then you're not going to win. And we just had a really, in my opinion, striking confirmation of that in the victory we had in Michigan. We won by one vote, 8-7. And it was absolutely critical that we had 150, 200 people in the courtroom and around the court, very militant, dedicated, young people. And I don't think there's any question whatever that those folks were critical in swaying at least one and probably more than one vote. I think you could say that that singular event, their presence there, made the difference. And of course, that there were that many people there only because there have been campaigns at the University of Michigan and throughout the Midwest around this for 10 years, most of which have been led by BAM. And there were people there who were not from BAM, and that's great, that they certainly deserve credit, but it was BAM that had organized and led it. So those two things, I think, are the critical things about BAM, attacking the notion of preference and emphasizing the importance of building a movement if we're going to win any of these things. I suppose the third thing, which is, and it goes along with building the movement, which is we've won a legal decision in Michigan, and I think we'll win it in the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court accepts review. But the next step is getting it implemented. And I think these universities have gotten so comfortable in not having significant numbers of black and Latino students on campus, and they have such pressure from right-wing alumni and so forth, that it's going to take a real fight to get them to put it in place. And just as Brown versus Board of Education was a great decision, but it actually didn't go into effect until the late 60s as a result of the movement, we don't want to wait 10 or 12 or 15 years to put this into effect. We've got to move right away.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on, in California during the time where the movement reached the level where it was going on the offensive, and there was debate whether or not to continue to use the SATs within the admission process, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'm probably not as familiar with the specifics on that, but I think the fight over using the SATs is in a way like the fight over affirmative action and the exceptions from the criteria of grades and test scores. In this way, I think those tests and those admission criteria favor students from white, upper middle class backgrounds, and those groups are very powerful. And standing behind them, major corporations who essentially it's much easier for them to take people from those groups and turn them into the employees they want in doing what they need to be doing. And so I think when President Atkinson, or Chancellor Atkinson, I guess, announced that he was backing away from the SAT, I think all of those groups mobilized to protect the privilege and the status they had, and they were able to essentially do that. I mean, the changes were minimal. And I think if you go back, the SAT test, for example, was initially instituted on a mass scale in this country in the late 1950s, and it was Clark Kerr from UC Berkeley and James Conant Bryant from Harvard who sponsored it, and Michigan was one of the first places that also used it. And at the time, there were faculty members who said, this is a racist test. This will exclude black students. They knew that. They knew that at the time. They didn't care about it in the late 50s, early 60s. By the middle 60s, they had to care about it because of the civil rights movement. And so the way they dealt with it then was, instead of getting rid of the test, which was very convenient for them, they made exceptions to the test, which they called affirmative action. So it's been the same fight for really 40 years, which is, how do you get black, Latino, and Native American students, and some other minorities, admitted into universities which were set up over a course of many, many years to take their student body from the most privileged sectors of society and contribute their graduates to the most privileged sectors of society.
Mm-hmm. So it was kind of my personal experience coming onto a campus like UC Berkeley and kind of not really seeing a movement around affirmative action, and BAM only being the organization on campus continuing that fight around Proposition 209 and exposing the lies and how the right is framing it as reverse racism and admitting underqualified students to the University of Berkeley, and then something like the Republican bake sale happening on campus, and all of a sudden the national media wants to know what's happening with these 5 college Republicans that are making this debate and framing it in a certain way. I was wondering if you can talk about why it's such an important issue in today's time, and also what is the relevance of the fight for affirmative action and why it's such an important issue.
Sure. Well, this country, as is often said, is becoming majority minority. And what's often lost in that is that in some states, like California and Texas, it already is. And among young people in this country, it either already is or almost already is a majority minority state. Country. It makes no sense whatever that at the very moment that the United States is changing into a country like it's never been before, to cut back by a third or a half on the admission of black and Latino and Native American students to the schools which will train the leaders of tomorrow. What that really is doing is creating segregation and a separate but equal society in a whole new form, in which the people who do the work of society will be increasingly black, Latino, Native American, and the people who administer the society will be white and in some areas Asian. And I think that's critical in terms of its importance in the movement. I think if you go back 150, 200 years in this country, the issue of race has been the crucial issue in the United States. it was the civil rights movement that opened the doors of universities in the 1960s to many students, that brought in, got federal student aid and federal aid to secondary education. That was the civil rights movement that did that. And I think when the civil rights movement, declines or doesn't exist, as has happened over the last, couple decades, you get things like charter schools and cutting in federal aid to education, not yet cutting student aid, but certainly, the increase in tuition and therefore the inability of many poor working class people of all races to go to college. That if the civil rights movement is not providing the crucial leading fight, then you get a cutback across the board. And I think the mistake people think is, well, okay, let's just fight around tuition, or let's just fight around closing of schools, or let's pretend race doesn't exist. But the problem is that race does exist, and the political support for those kind of right-wing moves is based on race. It's based on, there are a lot of undeserving people and we've got to cut back because there are too many people living, on the government. And if you can't counter that, if you can't attack that, you're not going to win. And beyond that, I think if you want to appeal to Black and Latino students who are the most dedicated, militant, have always been, really since the 50s and way back before that, you've got to recognize that there's a special, their problem is not just cost. Their problem is not just school closures. Their problem is the systematic discrimination. And unless you recognize that, you're not going to build an integrated movement. And if you don't build an integrated movement, in the 1960s you couldn't win. With the country as it is now, it's impossible to win. And I think, I went through the 60s, and the white left in this country talked a lot about, various economic and international and all kinds of things they were right on. But even then, they didn't recognize the critical importance of the civil rights movement and the Latino rights movement. And however horrendous a mistake that was in the 1960s, in 2012 and 2013, given the change in the country, it's ridiculous. I mean, the idea that you can build any kind of progressive movement in this country without taking on the issues of race, racism, and without relying on and building in the Black and Latino communities makes no sense whatever.
I was wondering if you could talk about BAM's intervention. What I've heard in the Supreme Court case of,
Sure.
of Grutter v. Bollinger.
Right.
And what was unique about BAM's position and the argument they were making and bringing into the court case, and also what differentiated it from the University
Sure.
of Michigan's argument.
If you look at many of the cases, in fact, all the cases except ours on affirmative action, and they've always been between the right wing and some government institution, the University of California, the University of Michigan, the University of Texas. And those institutions, to their credit, have at one point or another defended affirmative action in a certain way. But the real parties who are going to be harmed by that, the real people who are its targets, are Black and Latino students. And with the exception of the Michigan case, those students have not been present in the courtroom. And so the whole presentation has been skewed. And it's been skewed in part from the time of the first affirmative action decision, the Bakke case, which came out of the University of California, in which the University of California argued that, well, what we need is diversity. And that, that's true. Everybody agrees with that. But if you stop at that point, what you're really suggesting is that this is important for the large majority of, white students to rub elbows with and get to know Black and Latino students. That's true, But it's also, in its way, very patronizing and even racist, that the importance of affirmative action is its effect on the white students who are there. And we said in the Grutter case, in the district court, and really all the way along, is that no, there's another issue here, which is much more fundamental, which is the right of Black and Latino and Native American students to equality, to have an equal chance to go to these schools, and to overcome the racist tests and the other racist criteria that are present. And so that's what we put forth in the Grutter case, in the trial record. We put in, testimony from experts on testing, testimony from experts on the disparities in education in the country, testimony from experts as to the effect that the history of racial discrimination has had in this country, and I think. And presented it as an issue of equality. Now, I think that if you read the Grutter decision itself from the Supreme Court, you can see touches where that's recognized by the Supreme Court, which was a step forward from Bakke. It was, you can see it even in the decision by Justice O'Connor and other justices. But even more than that, I think the fact we presented that in the case meant that they were much more open to affirming affirmative action. Everybody thought that we were going to lose in the Supreme Court. In fact, we won, to the shock of almost every liberal in the country. And in part, I think that was the arguments we made and the presentation that was made. And I think even more than that, the fact that there were 50,000 people outside the Supreme Court on the day that it was argued, which they'd never seen before, haven't seen since. And that was, BAM initiated that. We got support from, after we started it, we got support from the NAACP, the UAW, and other organizations. But nevertheless, it was our initiative and really our people on the campuses who got lots of people. That made an enormous, enormous difference. And I think that's what was missing before 2003, and it's what's been missing in a way since then, because the established civil rights organizations have become even more, craven and passive and simply not doing anything other than hope that Obama gets elected or Kerry or whoever happens to be running. And then they get in office and essentially ignore what they promised beforehand. I think what we did was absolutely decisive. I mean, it changed history. I mean, it did, and I think if we win this case in the Supreme Court, it will change history. It's already changed history in the Midwest, and I think so. Anyway, I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to roll back. What we have, it's like the era after the Civil War. There was this tremendous period of reconstruction of racial progress in this country. There was then 30 years, which there was a constant move backwards until finally there was Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal was supposedly legitimate. And of course it wasn't separate or equal. It wasn't equal at all. And it took 60 years to overturn that decision. I think that's the period we're in now. We have a period in which great progress was made during the 60s and 70s. And then we've had, a backslide since that time, a backslide which has now reached unbelievable proportions, in which, major politicians think they can, enact measures that are openly designed to keep Black people and Latinos from voting. I mean, that everything that was won at Selma, they're trying to get rid of. And I think we've got to turn that around.
Great. What should new students joining the student movement in today's point in history, what should they understand about the issue of fighting around racism and fighting against racism and building a movement around affirmative action and the question of race in this country?
Well, first of all, I think what I've said is that it's just, a critical issue And if you really want to fight in this country about anything, you've got to build an integrated movement, and in order to do that, you've got to address the issues of racism among Black and Latino people and Native American and other people in this country. And I think also for students who are coming from white, middle-class homes, which by definition, there's enormous amounts of segregation. I think it's important for them to recognize that limitation in their own background, that there's a lot they don't know, and that, to be confident that you know what the answers are without, understanding what Black and Latino people are saying, is it in its way its own form of liberal racism. And that's not a moral statement about anybody, because, we all come with our own limitations, our own whatever. But if you really want to build a movement in this country, stop and think for a minute about, what the country is, where you come from, and what you've got to do, what's got to be done to change it. And that's not an argument for going into self-analysis and, sitting around in groups and talk, which some people do, because the only way you can overcome those things, and I can say this from my own history, the only way you overcome it is by learning from the civil rights movement, past and present, and taking action to, win things today. Because when you take action, you change. And then you change some more, and then you change some more. And it takes a long time, I think, and a profound inner struggle, really, to understand the issues of race and to fight to overcome this racism, because we live in a society which is exceptionally racist. Not as racist as it was 60 years ago, but all you've got to do, when we won the case involving the University of Michigan, I took occasion to read the comments in the newspaper that people wrote. And there are things which just stop one phrase short of openly racist words over and over and over again. And there's just there's on the one hand a tremendous progress we've made, including among the majority of white people in this country. On the other hand, there's still an enormous backwardness, people not understanding, and that's true for college students as much as it's true for anybody else.
Mm-hmm. One final question, if you could talk about the significance of the Supreme Court's decision around Prop 2 here in Michigan, and what's your analysis of moving forward around that decision, and kind of explain what recently happened?
Sure. We, in Michigan, the Prop 2 is exactly the same as Prop 209. It's a carbon copy of it. And the United States Court of Appeals, which is right below the Supreme Court, decided in November that the Michigan Proposal 2 was unconstitutional, which meant right away that it was possible to again have affirmative action at the University of Michigan and the other universities in Michigan, where there's been a 1/3 to 1/2 drop in Black and Latino enrollment over the last 5 years. The Attorney General of this state filed an immediate appeal to the Supreme Court, and that the Supreme Court decides whether to take the case. And I think we are going to support the Supreme Court taking the case, which seems surprising because we won, and in a way, it's conservative court, and you could say, well, we ought to let it go. But the truth is that, okay, we won in Michigan, but Michigan has about 1/5 the number of students as California, Arizona, and Washington, where similar proposals are still in effect and will be in effect. So in a way, we are not satisfied with winning it just for Michigan. We've got to win this for the whole country. I think there are one of two possibilities. If the Supreme Court grants review, and there's certainly a good chance they will, a very good chance I would say they will, if they grant review, it will then become I think, the most important, certainly the most important civil rights case in the country that's now pending, and one of the most important in the last decade or more, because it will be around the question of, do Black, Latino, and Native American citizens and residents have the right to politically fight for affirmative action, or can a white majority ban them from even going to the regents or the faculty or the universities and asking for that, which is what these proposals do. And what the proposals say is that to Black and Latino citizens and residents is, we are depriving you of the right even to ask for the only program that will allow your children to go to the universities of your state. And that is separate and unequal in a new form, in a new and grotesque form, clothed in the language of equality. And that's not any different. I mean, it's not an accident that in Plessy, the right wing called separate but equal. They said they're furthering equality. Well, Ward Connerly does the same thing today. So I think if the Supreme Court grants review, it will be a case for the whole country as to whether the country is going to deprive Black and Latino students and their parents and their communities of the right to even fight for the only way they can go to school under the existing system, or not. And therefore, it will be a national fight of tremendous importance. And I think you can say beyond that, that there's this whole myth that is fostered by the right wing and by these initiatives that we're a post-racial society, that it's all gone away and that we all love each other and everything's great. And all you have to do is drive into any one of our major cities, start in the suburbs, and just take any path you want, straight downtown. And you can see that we've not overcome, racial inequality in this country. And, or talk to people in the white communities and Black communities about pretty much anything, and you'll find out we have not overcome racial equality. And in a way, it's an issue, the case would be, are we as a country committed to overcoming the de facto segregation and inequality and injustice that continues to exist all around us? Or is the country going to pretend it doesn't exist and say we're all in a colorblind country, which is ridiculous? That's one possibility. If they take the case, it will be of that importance. If they don't take the case, and it's very interesting because Ward Connerly and other people have not asked the Supreme Court to take this case, which I think is because they think they might lose it. And I think what they're saying is, okay, we'll give you equality in Michigan in order to hang on to California, hang on to segregation and de facto inequality in California. If we win, I think what we'll have to do is fight to make the University of Michigan and the other schools in the Midwest to show, that affirmative action, to build a movement. And we'll have to use that as the platform to build a movement rebuild and strengthen the movement in California, Arizona, Washington, the other states of the West. I think, and we'll have to figure out some legal way to refile a challenge about California, because it's something like what Lincoln said. It's really impossible to have a country that's half free and half not free. And that's what it would mean if they turn it down is, okay, Michigan would have equality, but California wouldn't. And that makes no sense. So one way or the other, I think it will be an important, first of all, a victory, because if they review it, it means that all these years where that 209 has stayed without anybody looking at it is suddenly over, and we'll have a chance to overturn it. If they don't review it, we won't have that chance, but we will have affirmative action in Michigan, which of course is one of the most important public universities in the country after the University of California. So I think this case is really kind of a focal point. It's, as I said, though, I think it's only a focal point because let's say we were to flat out lose across the board. Well, then we're going to have to fight to get them to get rid of these tests, because we can't accept a decision which says, well, you can exclude the majority of the population from the schools. And I think we've got to fight to get things implemented now. The movement has to fight. BAM, and BAM will fight. We need, obviously, people of all political beliefs and organizations to join us, because we're not big enough to win it on our own. But we do need them to join us actively in this, because this is a fight really for what kind of country we're going to have. Are we going to have a separate and unequal country, in which case they will dismantle every social welfare program there is, slowly but surely? Or are we going to have a fight, to maintain those with an integrated movement, which is the only force that can win today? So I think it's a very, very important case. We think it's a very important case.